If you really love somebody, do you have to die for them? Do you have to take a bullet? Do you have to sacrifice some vital organ that they might live? Is this what Jesus meant when he said, "Greater love hath no man than this, than that he lays down his life for his friend"? We're going to take a look at that today. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're working verse by verse through 1 John. We've come to chapter 3 and verse 16. And John says, we know love by this. This is the way we have experientially come to know love. He writes this up here, our word for know, and he uses a perfect tense in the Greek, indicating that it's something that we came to know in the past with the result that we still know this. And it's not just something we know intuitively. We don't just know this with our mind, but we also know this in the realm of our experience. And this is as John is speaking about his own experience. Remember, he was in that upper room. And he says, by this then we know love, that one, going back in the context to Jesus Christ, that one in our place laid down his life. And we are obliged that we ought to, in behalf of our brothers, lay down our lives. Brothers, by the way, and I don't think we should have to say this, but they just use that word generally. If they're speaking to a crowd of people, everybody in that room was brothers. Sometimes they singled out women when they were talking specifically just to them, and they said sisters. But this is the way they spoke, and I trust you all understand that. But he says, this is how we've come to know this. Now, to what event is he referring? Well, I want to go back, and I want to jump back to John chapter 13. And if you remember, at the end of this chapter, Jesus is going to give them command, and he says that you are to love one another as I will love you? No, as I have loved you. Now, what he means by that is what he's referring to here in John chapter 13 and verse 3. They've shared the Passover meal together as just Jesus and his disciples, and when that meal is over, verse 3 says, and Jesus, knowing that the Father had handed all things over to him, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God. In other words, he fully understood everything about himself and his relationship with God. He wasn't confused. He didn't know these things. John is telling us this because he wants us to understand that this person he's telling us about is God, and he is man, and he knows exactly what he's doing. He's not feeling his way through his earthly ministry trying to figure this out. From the very beginning, he knew exactly what he was there to do. And part of that was going to be he was going to lay down his physical life on the cross. But as he says here, knowing all of these things, all of that is background. This is all a setup here. Knowing all these details, he knows these precisely. Verse 4, he got up from the supper, laid his outer garments aside, and he took a towel, tied it around himself, poured water into the basin, and began washing the disciples' feet and wiping them with the towel which he had tied around himself. Now, he washes their feet. We don't need to go through any more of this story. This is what he's doing. At the end of this story, Jesus then turns to the disciples after he takes the towel off and puts his garment back on. He says, you've seen what I have done? And he says, if I being your master and Lord, absolutely true, you're completely accurate on that. If I have done this for you, then you ought to do the same for each other. In other words, literally wash feet. I know we keep coming back to that. Literally washing feet. That's what he's telling them. Well, that might be appropriate in their culture. There might be times, hey, I was on a vacation and we walked on the beach, and when you come in off the beach, man, I don't care what you try to do, you got sand on your feet. Maybe it would be appropriate to wash somebody's feet. But it's the larger issue that he's talking about, and that is that you ought to serve one another. It was not common that the master of a house, the owner of a house, the host would wash the feet of his guests. He would ask his servant in the house to do that. And Jesus has just done, as the master, the role of a servant, in washing his disciples' feet. And this is what he's telling them. And this is what the new commandment really is about. How do you love other believers? You do so by serving them. And there's a variety of ways to serve them. It may be your spiritual gift, but you should never limit your service to your spiritual gift, because maybe it's going to be something. I don't have the spiritual gift of raking or mowing somebody's lawn or helping clean their house or paint their house. I have a spiritual gift of pastor teacher, but that doesn't mean that I can't help fix food for them or rake their lawn or mow their lawn, or for that matter, to sit down and just visit and listen to them. That can be an act of loving service. And so I want to jump over to John chapter 15, which we already referenced this in the introduction. He says, but in verse 12, Jesus is speaking. He says, this is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Again, being a servant. Greater love has no one than this, than he lay down his life for his friend. And I know we look at that and we think that means taking a bullet because Jesus died on the cross for us. But Jesus, when he was talking about this and he says, as I have loved you, he's looking back to that act of service. And so laying your life down doesn't necessarily mean dying for somebody, for taking a bullet, but it means laying your life down by serving them. There are a lot of Christians that want to be involved in church, and we want to do things, and we want important jobs, and we don't think of the mundane jobs of service to other believers. And yet those mundane jobs are precisely how we show love to other believers. Yes, we can do it by doing the big things. Don't get me wrong. That also can be in this. But it's just the mundane service. And I hate to use the word mundane, but I'm doing it only for emphasis, that we need to get past this idea that unless there's a title attached to this or a specific function, or it's something that the church stands up and talks about. You know, some of the most important service that I have had the opportunity of doing is not in the room behind me out here in what we call an auditorium, standing behind the podium and teaching a Bible study. Probably some of the most important opportunities to serve or love are simple acts that we get to do where we engage with individual believers. And I might not be verbally teaching anything. I might simply just be with other believers, to lay down his life for his friend. We go back over to 1 John, and he's going to give us a very specific example. For whoever has the world's goods, and this word that's translated world, there it is, but the word goods is from our word bios, or we get our word biology from this. It was a word that they used for life, or the things of life. I was thinking about it this way. What do you absolutely need to be able to live? Well, number one, you need to eat. You need food. Second of all, for most of us, you need some clothing. You don't need fancy clothing, but you need adequate clothing. You need clothing that, I live in a part of the country where, we can get down to 0 degrees, or sometimes on rare occasions even below 0. So you need adequate clothing to protect you when it's very cold. The things of this world. In other words, you have those things, or we could even say, or you have the means of procuring those things, namely money in some way. And you see his brother in need. Need meaning they actually don't have adequate food to survive, and they actually don't have adequate clothing to survive in whatever environment. In their part of the environment, we think of trying to stay warm, but in their part of the world, they had to cover up. I work in a place where there's a lot of agricultural workers, and when they're out there working, they're not out there in shorts and t-shirts like I used to do when I would work for my grandfather. They're out there all bundled up in the heat because it actually keeps them protected from the ravages of the sun, and they work all day like that. So when we think about having adequate clothing, it's not just for the cold. It even could be adequate clothing to deal with the heat. And understanding that you have that, you see a brother that has a need. He doesn't have adequate food. He doesn't have adequate clothing. And you close up your heart. This word heart in the Greek literally was a word that referred to what we call your gut down here. And every one of us, and I've said this before here in our Bible studies, I think every one of us knows what it's like to get that sinking feeling in your gut when you hear about something that's happened to somebody, or you've witnessed something and you're just like, oh. Now, in our modern language, we say closes up his heart to him. We have a different metaphor than we have this feeling in our gut normally. You close up, how does God's love abide in him? In other words, what he's telling us, you know how you lay down your life for a brother? If you've got the means to help a brother that legitimately has needs. By the way, the word here that he uses for see, that word see means to see with clarity, to be able to see and understand it, not a casual glance and go, I don't know if their clothing is adequate. No, you really can see clearly they do not have adequate means. That's the idea. It's not just a passing glance or anything like that. And what he says is the way you're going to love a brother, the way you're going to lay your life down for them, is you're actually going to do something to meet their need. Now, he gave 2 needs here in terms of material needs, but there's other needs. And we've already mentioned those. You know, there's some people that just need you to take some time with them. That's what they need. You might have somebody that needs you to fix something for them. I had a good friend in our church years ago. There was a widowed woman in our church. She had a light that didn't work on her back step when she went out. And she tried to change light bulbs. That didn't fix it. But he had the skill to go and take that apart and fix it, and he repaired her light so that when she had to go in and out of the back steps of her house, she had a light so she could see what she was doing. And you know what? I remember that. That sticks in my mind because I was thinking, that was a good example of love that I witnessed there. And he didn't get up at church and parade, look at this great thing that I did. Let's stick it in some note that the church had. No, he just did it. It was an act of love to provide for somebody else. So John says, little children, let us not love in word or with tongue, but in deed and in truth. He has to say this here because these spiritually young believers, some of them being influenced by the antichrists, don't realize that the love that they should be demonstrating towards others really is very concrete, and it's not in terms of I love you, I love you, I love you. I could go around telling my wife all day long I love her, and I do tell her daily that I love her. But if I did all that and I never did anything, or I was just saying it but it wasn't genuine, so it wasn't truth, well, it'd fall on deaf ears. And you know what? There have been some times where I haven't been in action loving towards my wife. I just kind of have been selfish. And guess what? She recognizes that. And she recognizes that what comes out of my mouth when I've said I love you, it's just like, yeah, I don't believe that. I don't see it. Probably anybody that's ever been in a relationship knows what that's like to have somebody say, hey, I care about you, I love you. And other people thinking, really? I don't know. Because you never call on me. You never check on me. You have no interest in what's going on really with me. And John says, love in work and in truth. It's okay to tell a person you love them, but it better be backed up by what you actually do. And it better be genuine, not just going through the motions because you don't want a person to think the worst of you, but it's genuine. We know love because Jesus laid down his life by getting down and washing the feet of the disciples, and we can do the same, metaphorically, meeting the needs of our brothers and sisters in Christ, genuinely and indeed. Real practical truth, as John is encouraging these spiritually young believers with, this is really how you love. And some of us, even when we've grown a bit, it doesn't hurt us to be reminded. As always, have a good day in the Lord, and I want to thank you for joining me.